Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to create a PHP console application. So if you ever wondered how Laravel's artisan command works or Symfony's console command, this is the video for you. Okay, so let's start off with a blank project. The only thing I configured so far was Composer, where I've set the namespace we're going to use for this console application. I've also installed Symfony's var dumper, which will help us display objects or variables on the screen much easier. Now let's go ahead and create our entry point for our console application. So in the root of our directory, we'll create a file called console. And on the first line of the console application, we're going to paste in the shebang. Now the shebang is used in Unix-based applications to tell the interpreter that it needs to use PHP. So the second thing we need to do is we need to tell VS Code to treat this file as a PHP file. So what you can do is down the bottom where it says plain text, you click on that, then you just select your language as PHP, and there you go. Now you can see that is treated as a comment within the PHP file. What we can do now is add our PHP open tags, and now we can include our vendor autoload file. So we can have auto loading working as well. Now, just to make sure that this is working, let's just echo something on the screen to make sure that we've wired this up correctly. We can go into our console and we can say PHP console, and it should echo hello world on the screen. Now, the next thing we want to do is to create the kernel that will basically execute the application and then return the status code. So let's create a kernel. We can say new kernel, and then it's going to return a status from the kernel handle method. And then we're going to exit the application, passing in our status code, like so. Now we don't have a kernel yet, so let's go into our source folder and create our kernel class. PHP open tag. So now we need to set the namespace, which is the namespace we specified in our composer file, which is pixelfix console. And then we create our kernel class. And then we're going to have one public method in this kernel class called handle. And it's going to return a status, which is going to be an integer. And so let's just return 0 for now. And to make sure this is working, we can say, just echo hello from inside the kernel. All right, and then we just need to make sure that we import our kernel into our entry point. And then if we run this now, and there we see it's hello from inside the kernel, meaning that our kernel is now hooked up and working properly. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want an application that's actually going to run the code within our console application. So let's create a application class. Okay. And we set the namespace as pixelfix console, and we create our class called application. And in our application class, we'll have a public function called run. And this is going to return that status, which is going to be an integer. And let's just return 0 for now. And then in our kernel, or let's go into our console, we want a new application. So application. And then when we instantiate our kernel, we want to pass that in as a parameter. Now in our kernel, we need to create our constructor to accept the application variable. We can say private application, like so. So now we can say this application run, and that is going to return a status, and then we're going to return the status within our handle method. And now if we go to application, we can say hello from inside the application. Let's just spell that correctly. And if we run this, it should now say hello from inside the application, meaning that that's working as well. Now, the next thing we want to do is to create our commands folder. Now, in our source folder, we create a folder called command. And in our command, let's create our first command. Let's call this, for an example, we're going to call it addition, because we're going to make a math application that's going to add two values together. So let's create our class. We set the namespace, console, and commands. And then we create our class is addition. And we want two parameters here. Well, we want one parameter for now. Let's say private static name. Oops. String name, really, name. And we're going to call this math.addition. Then we want a public function called execute, which is going to return a status, which is going to be an integer. Let's just return 0 for now. And then we want another static function or public static function that will return the name of our command. So this is going to return a string. And we're going to say return static name. And we just make this a static function because we're going to call it statically. And what we can do now is just say echo hello from inside the addition. PHP, let's make it end of line. Let's make that capitals. Okay, now back in our application, we're going to, now we need to load our commands. So we can say this dot register commands. And we don't have that function yet, so we're going to create it and say register commands. It's not going to return anything, so we'll keep it at void. We also make this a private function. And then we want to read through our commands folder. So we can say our command files, and we're going to use the directory iterator from PHP. And then we're going to pass in, no, we're not going to call it statically. It needs to be an instance. So we'll say new directory iterator. And the constructor argument would be the directory we're looking for. So we're going to say directory / commands. Right, and so let's just dump this out to make sure that it's reading correctly. Okay, and then we can say run this again, and we are getting an error. And that is because it can't find this file specified. And that would be because I said commands here and I made the folder command. So I'm going to rename this actually to commands, because it's going to hold more than one command. So if we run this now again, we should see the directory iterator instance. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to iterate over the command files to only register the actual files and not if it's a directory or something else. So let's go say for each command files as command file. And then we can say if the command file is file. So we want to say if it's not a file, then we just want to continue over the for each. And then we want to say this command, we want a command name. We want to add it to the command. Now, first of all, we don't have a variable called commands, so we can say private array commands, and we'll default that to an empty array. And now we need to get the command, and we'll get that by adding the namespace, which we don't have just yet. And we'll get the path info from the command file, and we only want the file name. And then we also want the command name. And we're going to get that because this is going to return the namespace of our command. We can then say we want the command, and we call our getName function on it. Now, in order for us to get our namespace, we're going to need a variable passed into our constructor. So let's create our constructor. And let's say we accept a string. Let's make it a private string namespace. All right, and then in our console, we need to create a namespace. Now, the namespace is going to be the same namespace as our commands. So we'll take this namespace, and we'll say we create a namespace variable. And we'll just make sure that we add double backslashes, and remember to add the double backslash at the end as well. And now we're going to pass in our namespace into our application constructor. Now, if we go back to our application, we can, let's say after this, let's dump out our commands to see if it has registered correctly. So now if we run our application, there you go. Our math addition command has successfully been registered within our application. Now, the next thing we want to do is to pass our options, because we're obviously going to want to pass in some numbers into our math application in order to add them together. So let's create a function called pass options, and we'll make this a private function as well. And we'll keep it at void because it's not going to return anything. And let's say we have a args v variable. Okay, but let's dump this out to see what we're getting. We don't have it at the moment, so let's go and create it. And we're going to create it by passing it into our constructor. We're going to say we want a private array called args v. And in order for us to get that, let's get that from our console. And we can say we want our args_v, and in order to get that, let's say create a variable called args_v, and we get that from the server called args_v. All right. Now what we can do is, if it doesn't return an array, we'll just assign a default array to it. So now back in our application, let's make sure we run our pass options. And let's see what we get back from our console. All right, so now we can see the first option we get is console, but let's just run that again and let's say we want math. That's our command name. And now you can see the first parameter from our args_v variable is the console, is our application name. Then the second argument is the command name. And we need to check if that exists. So what we can do is we can say if it's not set, let's say this args_v, our first parameter, or parameter at our index 1, then we want to throw a new exception, but we don't have an exception yet. So let's go in our commands folder and create, no, we don't want a commands folder, it needs to be in the source folder. Let's say we want a command exception. Okay, and we can just say PHP, the namespace is console, we want a command exception, and that's just going to extend the default exception class. And we don't need anything else. We can just say we want to throw a new command exception, and we're going to say command not provided. All right, so let's see how that works. So we just remove this and we do it without a parameter, and then, yep, there we go. We get our exception that says command not provided. So the next thing we want to do is, now that we know that the item 0 and item 1 from our args_v array is the application name and the command name, we want to remove that from our array. So now we can say options equals, say, array slice, and we want to slice the array, say args_v, and we want to slice the first 2 positions. So now let's just dump out our options and see if we get the correct options back. So now we can say we want math, say, addition, and we want 5, and our second parameter is 3. So there we go. So that is the options we receive from our command line. And what we can do now is remove that, and we can say this args equals that, the array slice, but we don't have the args just yet. So let's create that as a private array and call that args, and then we'll default that to an empty array as well. Okay, so now that we've passed our options, we can go back to our run command and put this into action. Now, the first thing that we need to check is if the command that was provided, if that exists in our commands array. So we can say if array key exists, and then we pass in the key, which is this command name, which we don't have yet. We'll fix that up. And the array we want to check is these commands. Let's just fix that up quick. We can say private string command name, and we'll just default that to an empty string. And then in our pass options, we need to assign our command name the value of this args 1. Because we know now after this check that that exists, and now we assign it to our command name variable. So now back in this line over here, now if the array key doesn't exist, we throw a new, say, command exception, and then we can say command not found. Let's test that. We can say math addition. We say math subtraction. We know that doesn't exist. And then we get an exception that says command not found. Okay, so we know that is working. So what we can do now is to get our command from our commands array. So you can say our command is this command, and what we want is this command name. All right, and now we know that command is a class name, so we can say we're expecting a status from that command. We can say new command, and then we're calling the execute function on that command, and we're passing in these args. All right, then we can remove this line now, and we can then return our status. Now, just to make sure that this is working, we can go to our addition, and we need to make sure that we receive our array args. And we can say dump out the args. And if we do this and we say we want to call our addition, and we want to pass in, say, 2 and 3, we should do two results now. We'll say the arguments array, which is the ones we dumped out here, and we have hello from inside the addition command. Now, the next thing we want to do is just to actually wire this up so it actually adds all the information that we want it to add. So we can say let's make it total 0. And you can say we want to go through each of the args as an arg, or you can say, let's say we want it as a value. So this one, sorry, it should be args. And then we can say total plus equals the value. And then we can say we want to echo out, let's say the total is, and then we're going to say total. And then we just add a end of line. And then we return 0. So if we go down to our command line and we'll say we want to add 2 and 3 together, we run this and there we go. We see the total is 5, meaning that this command is now executed successfully. Now, the next thing we want to do is we just want to make sure that the whole thing is working automatically. So what we do is we'll just copy this command and we'll rename it to subtraction. And we'll say we want this as subtraction and subtraction. And what we're going to do is we'll just take our arguments. We'll just assume we're going to receive 2 arguments. So we'll say the total equals args 0 minus args 1. And then we're going to say the total is whatever the total is. All right, so now if we run this, we can say subtraction. We want to subtract 10 and we want to subtract 4. And then we see the total is 6, meaning that our auto wiring is working properly. We can just keep adding more commands into our commands folder and it should automatically just work. Now, another thing that we have to add is some sort of control on how our commands need to look. Now, the thing our commands need to have is it needs to have an execute function and it needs to have a get name function. Otherwise, our code is going to crash. So in order for us to do that, in our source folder, we're going to create a command interface. And that is going to dictate how our commands should look. So let's create a namespace, console, and then we say interface, command, interface. And then the first thing we want is a public function called execute. Execute should return an integer, should accept an array called args, and we can default that to an empty array. And we also need to have a public static function called getName, and that should return a string. All right, and now what we just need to do is on our commands, we need to implement our command interface. And now we can see I've already got some errors here. So that needs to default to an empty array, and our subtraction will have the same issue here. Let's implement our command interface, fix up our arguments. And now we can add a check in our application to make sure that our commands implement this interface and throw an exception if it doesn't. So what we're going to do is we can say our command instance equals new command. And then we can say if we'll check if the command instance is an instance of command interface, and if it is not, then we will throw a new exception. So throw new command exception, and we'll just say command is not implementing. All right, let's just spell it right. Implementing the correct interface. And then if that passes, then we know it's implementing the right interface. And then we can say our command instance execute with the args, and we're going to receive the status and return the status. So now we can delete that line. Just make sure that everything is correct. So we get the command from there. We can instantiate the command. We then check if it's a part of the instance. If not, that is fine. Okay, so let's run this and see if it still works. And there we go. Our command subtraction is working. Just to make sure that it still works. If we don't implement the interface, now we should expect an error. All right, there we go. You can now see the command is not implementing the correct interface. So let's just put that back, make it working again. And that should be it. So as long as all of your commands that you add into this folder implements that interface, you should just be able to add commands and your application should work fine. And I think that is it for this video about creating a command line application within PHP. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.